Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, in the first review of 2019, I'm talking about the third album from BT, Movement in Still Life. Okay, this is going to be a handful to talk about. I barely even know where to begin. I guess I can start by saying this has always been a personal favorite of mine in the BT catalog, to the point of it making on my favorites of all time list a couple years ago. And for years, I considered it to be an improvement on the material presented on ESCM. In a lot of ways, that is still undoubtedly the case. From a production level, ESCM still used all this technology that hasn't totally aged well. You can tell it came right out of the 90s. Movement in Still Life sounds like BT got some real budget behind him, though. The sound quality is a huge step forward. It's also the first BT album where the credits lists start to get really long, as is always seemed to do these days. Not just with the mastering and recording engineers and additional editors behind the scenes on top of the guest singers and turntablists, but also a lot more producer collaborations. Paul Van Dyke and Sasha are here again. Also Tsunami 1, who I mainly knew for an Orbital remix they did, and freaking Hybrid helped produce one track too. In fact, the latter collab, Running Down the Way Up, is the track that initially introduced me to BT, because I was a Hybrid fan for quite a while before I became a BT fan, and my love for Hybrid's music had me searching out rare tracks for their credits, and I ended up finding another one of my favorite artists in the process. Thing is though, while technologically and budget-wise Movement in Still Life is a big step forward, I'm not totally sure if I hold it up nearly as highly as I used to. ESCM's dated 90 synths helped add to its charm for me, and I think as a whole it was a lot better put together from a pacing standpoint. It grew on me a lot more through my review of it. My thoughts on this album, though, have gotten a lot more complicated as I've started to re-listen to it and evaluate it for what it is. Now, it's not saying it's not a fantastic album, because it totally is, and I'm still gonna give a high recommendation for it. ESCM really only had one massive iconic standout track in Flaming June. Other standouts like Firewater, Remember, and The Road to Lost Withiel still kinda feel like deep cuts in his overall catalog. The standouts in this album are a lot more numerous, often hit the same emotional heights that Flaming June could, along with being more easily recognizable in general. But as a whole piece, I'm less sure about how it comes together. It has more little nitpicks that get under my skin. By the way, this is another album that has different US and UK versions, and unlike ESCM, which only has a 2-track difference, these two versions are fundamentally different albums with very different strengths and weaknesses, so this is going to be a really freaking long video, so strap yourselves in, people. Now, I'm used to the UK version with this album cover here, so the one that starts with the title track and ends with Satellite. I think most people consider that to be the superior version. I do as well. So I'm gonna be focusing more on that version in this video, but there's a lot to say about both. Now, the thing about the UK version is that it takes a while to really get going for me. Once it hits the track Mercury and Solace, it basically enters into 9 out of 10 territory and stays there until the end. But the first couple of tracks kinda start me off on the wrong foot. The title track on this thing is one I really want to like more than I actually do. I feel like it's half trying to do something similar to Firewater and being this shifting and changing piece that's supposed to live up to its title. Instrumentally, it's really interesting, has a lot of cool side tracks that I've always loved BT for, and the core break beats are really hard-hitting and synth grooves are really fun. But there's two elements to this track that really hold it back for me. First of all, the Dance to the Beat, Shuffle My Feet sample that runs throughout the track is kinda corny to me and grates on my nerves. You take that element out and it'd be so much better to me, as is it really makes the track feel more dated than it needed to be. Sure, there's turntable scratching all over it too, but that can add flavor around the edges that make it dated in a fun way. That's what other tracks on here do. That main sample is kind of annoying though, honestly. The other element of the title track I don't like is that freaking phone message that starts the track out. It's this random dipshit who wants to collab with BT because he's a big name and will give this nobody a publicity or something like that. So he's like, he calls him up to say, "Hey dude, you wanna make some beats for me?" and something like that. I mean, the inclusion of this message feels like a BT bragging about being rich and famous now to the point of needing to change his phone number to avoid randos. And as the first thing you hear in the album is just kinda cringy and doesn't clue you in at all to what makes this album great in the first place. Sometimes I'm in the right mood to be okay with the cornier elements like these and ignore them in favor of the fun and interesting instrumental, but it's not an opener that particularly gets me hyped, especially in comparison to other ones like Firewater or Suddenly. The collabs with Sasha and Tsunami 1 in this opening stretch, Ride and the Hip Hop Phenomenon respectively, similarly have never really resonated with me on a deeper level. Ride is at least the more memorable of the two, has a neat bassline and fun vocoder vocals. But I don't know, it just kind of falls flat for me more often than not. It's not one of the more interesting moments on here. And the Hip Hop Phenomenon is probably the least memorable track in the bunch. It has the vocoder voices that say the title, they're kind of catchy I guess. But more than anything, it just kind of blends into the background and feels like filler to me. The elements that work best about it, like its breakbeats and other synths, are better executed elsewhere on this album. Also doesn't really live up to its title, there's really no hip-hop on this track. And it came right after Madskillz-Mic Chekka, which had actual rappers and it was more obvious about its hip-hop influence. Now you'd think from that terrible title, Madskillz-Mic Chekka, you'd think it incorporates the rappers in a corny and dated way in the same way the title track did, but actually worked way better this time, and is the one genuinely great moment from that opening 4-track stretch. The rapping from Hutchie, Planet Asia, and Rasco is super fast-paced and energetic and really adds the propulsive energy of the track in the same way something like, for example, Orbital's Wonky does. The breakbeats and bass lines are more hard-hitting than all the others around it. It's the one moment from this album that transcends its inherent datedness and makes those elements so much more fun. Still, the hip-hop faux coolness in those first 4 tracks is not always the easiest to swallow. Those tracks are still good, but not great, and don't show why I consider this album to be so great in general. Like I mentioned before, Mercury and Solace is where this album really picks up and never comes back down, as it were. From here it's much more straightforward trance and progressive house, and I think that stuff is much better done than what came before. It plays much more to BT's strengths. Mercury and Solace itself is this really smooth but propulsive piece with airy vocals from Jan Johnston. It's like the ESEM stuff but with much better production, and from there it gets even better. Dreaming is probably the big centerpiece of the album. Partially a cover of the track We'll Go Dreaming by Judy Tsuke, also performed by the one and only Kirstie Hawkshaw herself. Always a plus, and also one of her best guest appearances ever. But she's only part of the equation. BT's production behind her is absolutely beautiful. Sometimes it's a string orchestra with this clock ticking. Sometimes it's just super propulsive and simple trance grooves. Sometimes BT gets a little weirder with the rhythms and breakbeats and stutter edits. Sometimes there's little DJ scratches that just add to the energy. At one point he just cuts the instrumental out entirely and lets Hawkshaw singing sit out there in the open by itself. It's such a fun and epic track that runs out for 9 minutes and never gets boring, undoubtedly among his best work ever. From there that tone is kept up on the somewhat morbid Giving Up the Ghost. For a while, that one didn't stick out to me much, especially being tasked to follow up Dreaming. It's not better than that. But something about that repetitive vocal hook that sounds like it's repeatedly saying, I wanna die, I wanna die, I wanna dance. That's basically my whole life right there, isn't it? Otherwise, it's a really straightforward and well-produced trance anthem that's mostly instrumental and is epic and propulsive like this kind of track should be. And speaking of straightforward and well-produced trance, Godspeed is another huge high point in that department. Kind of like Flaming June, but without the obvious Paul Van Dyke contributions. In fact, it's the one track on here that BT is the sole credit. No outside help from other producers or engineers or anyone, just him by himself. And okay, while I don't like it as much as Flaming June, still like the main melody on that one better. This is almost equally as good, and with better production on top of that. And if you miss the lack of Paul Van Dyke, you will get your fill on the next track, Namistai, which is honestly probably more Van Dyke's track than it is BT's, but is nevertheless a big standout moment in its own right. Probably fits better on Van Dyke's own Out There and Back album, but I like it better here because it's not surrounded by several other tracks that sound just like it. From there, we get Running Down the Way Up, the above-mentioned collab with Hybrid. Kinda not what I would have expected going into it. When I first heard it, I was like, this is great, but where's the orchestra? But it became clear pretty quickly that what Mike Truman brought to the table was the percussion. That breakbeat is just like the ones from Wide Angle. There's some whooping synths around in areas that remind me of this one-off Hybrid single called Accelerator. Otherwise, it's this mostly acoustic guitar-driven piece, and the real star of the show is once again Kirstie Hawkshaw. It's mostly her track, with obvious production flares added by BT and Hybrid. Very light and smooth, atmospheric type stuff, with still a strong beat behind it. And there's some strings and parts that I always failed to notice, as it were. They're really subtle and placed in the background. Admittedly, not a lot of BT to be found here, aside from stutter edits, and assumingly he had the primary direction, but it was the track that first got me into him. So it'll always have a special place in my heart, and it's still just as good to me now as it was then. And finally, we end in kind of a weird place with Satellite, this kind of alt-rock ballad sung by BT himself. I kind of mentioned in the ESCM review that BT didn't come off to me as that great a singer there, but his singing actually did improve a noticeable amount here. He puts a lot of heart and emotion into his performance on this track, even though I have no idea what the lyrics mean. That sense of warmth the entire thing conveys, and how much BT himself is obviously feeling it, really creates the emotional pathos that make it a perfect closer to the album, in spite of not having anything like it elsewhere on the album. So that's my breakdown of the UK version, and oh boy, we are not done yet. We gotta talk about the US version as well. The US version is a very different album. 4 tracks were traded out entirely and only appear on this version of the album, cutting out Ride, the hip-hop phenomenon, Giving Up the Ghost, and Namistai, replacing them with Shame, Never Gonna Come Back Down, Smart Bomb, and Love on Height Street. The track listing got shifted around a lot too, new versions of other tracks got traded out, and even got a totally different album cover. Now, in some ways, I can definitely see some improvements in the US version, namely in terms of pacing and sequencing, with one exception in the latter department I'll get to. I think the US version feels more cohesive and more like everything belongs together, while the UK version could feel kind of an awkward mixed bag sometimes. This version starts with Madskillz-Mic Chekka, which I think is a better choice for an opener than the title track as well, even though they mark it as a remix, despite it barely being any different from the original at all. Why they did it for this and not Love, Peace, and Grease, saving me the confusion is beyond me, but never mind that. I'll admit I even like all the tracks exclusive to this version of the album. Shame is probably my personal favorite of the 4. It's a rougher alt-rock track that's like if Solar Plexus actually fit BT's style and personality and had better singing. Still not as good as Satellite, but is still pretty great. Never Gonna Come Back Down features rapping and singing from Mike Doty of Soul Coughing. I mainly know him from his appearance on 808 State's Don Solaris, and of course I like him more there. Here he sounds a bit more like he's trying to be trendier, with kinda cringy moments like dun dun diggy dun and Sharif. But otherwise, the track is super fun and energetic and catchy and anthemic. It's a lot of fun. The other 2 I'm less hot on, but are still pretty fun. You know, hip-hop influenced stuff, again. Smart Bomb is kind of like if you took those rougher breakbeat parts of the UK version of Love, Peace, and Grease and added a catchy rap hook on top. Back on the set and covering all bets. And Love on High Street is admittedly a strange ending as well. Just a straight hip-hop track with full extended rap verses from 50 Grand and Rasco, and a pretty nice, chill instrumental. Now the Donald Trump reference that Rasco made here is not aged well at all, but it's still pretty nice, I guess. But I cannot bring myself to say that the US version is better overall. Thing is, if you look at the credits on the US version, you may see that the management section is bigger. There were people from the record label that participated and get direct credits too, and let me tell you, the fact that there was more record label interference on this version really freaking shows. Everything about this version feels like it was tweaked to hell and back in order to be more marketable to the US audience. There's more rap and hip-hop, more of a focus on trendier elements. All the tracks are shorter and feel like they're trying to be more radio-friendly, right down to the album cover, which shows BT looking more like a model than he maybe ever has. And that freaking expand rough font they use on the back, good God. Also, 2 unforgivable fuck you moves that prevent me from signing off on this version. The fact that they cut down Dreaming to 5 minutes. Why? And the fact that they don't end with Satellite. They move it in smack dab in the middle to track 6. I mean, Love on Haight Street may work alright as an ending to the album, but it's not freaking Satellite. Yeah, quite ashamed that it goes this way. The UK version, for all my gripes with it, feels more like it's how BT originally intended it to sound, and his influence is felt far more. The US version sounds like a marketing department butchered it in spite of the exclusive tracks still being pretty solid. I have those on the separate Still Life in Motion EP on my iPod in case I ever want to listen to those out of context, so yeah, that's finally all the thoughts I have on Movement and Still Life. So yeah, a lot of complicated thoughts on this album. I may have my problems with BT's original vision of the album, and I feel like it takes a while to fully really get going for me. But there's still no denying it's a big part of my life. The worst tracks are still fun, the best tracks are among the best and most iconic tracks of BT's entire career, and hell, even if the US version is a big step down for me, it gets enough things right to still be pretty dang good. The version I'm going to link in the description will be the UK version, and that also seems to be a deluxe edition that includes Never Gonna Come Back Down and a pretty solid B-side called Fibonacci Sequence, as well as some random remixes tacked down at the end. But that original version that goes from the title track to Satellite, that's the one I most enjoy listening to. So yeah, Movement and Still Life, it's a weird album with way too many thoughts and rants I have on it, making this video probably way longer than it needs to be, but it's still a long-time favorite. I still think everyone ought to listen to it at some point, so yeah, I'll just leave it at that. On the UK version, I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. On the US version, a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, it's just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. There are some people you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something. Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So that's all for today. See you next time.